next up, we have Chen who will be talking to us about body lateral deformation and compliance and how that helps snakes deal with these large obstacles or large traversal steps in their environments. So thanks very much.
Thanks, Henry, for organizing this symposium and inviting me. So I'm going to give you guys an overview of the work that we've been doing over the past 2.5 years in my lab. So snakes are extremely good at moving through almost any environment, as you already saw from Bruce's talk. So very often they have to go over a complex 3D environment where you can clearly see that they need to deform their body in 3 dimensions by a large amount. Snake robots, because of their similar morphology to snakes, have been long thought to be able to provide a versatile platform to help us humans perform many critical tasks. And you can also imagine that they will also have to deform their body substantially out of the plane in 3 dimensions to perform these tasks. And many snake robots have been developed over the last few decades to try to do that. When we look at our knowledge of snake locomotion, here's a survey that we did of the out-of-plane body deformation plotted as a function of the obstacle height, if there is an obstacle, if not, it's 0. And what we notice is that the majority of the studies where the snake deform has large body, 3D body deformation are in arboreal environment, and there's also some studies on gliding, but for the majority of the work that snakes move on the ground, we can see that they are most often studied on flat surfaces where the body goes through a near 2-dimensional deformation. So we have this relative lack of knowledge of how snakes do so for snake locomotion on the ground. So what might be different between snake locomotion with near 2D versus large 3D body deformation? When we look at near 2D body deformation on a flat surface, you can see that regardless of the different modes, they are inherently stable unless the surface is vertical or inverted. But when they have to use large 3D body deformation, then stability becomes a major challenge, as you can clearly see from this video from Howie Chosa's group. Try to replay that. Yeah, so this robot is using a helical artificial side winding, and you can see that it struggles because it suffers roll instability. So how does snake solve this stability challenge? As Bruce has already showed a lot of them in arboreal environment use branches or twigs. They would grip their body onto these smaller structures to use them as anchor points for stability. And on steep sand dunes, snake can also, side winding snakes can also press onto the surface to create a little dent and use that as their anchor points to maintain stability. And snake robots have also similarly used these strategies to maintain stability in such situations. But in nature and artificial environment, there are also other types of obstacles which might be very large, too large or too smooth for you to wrap your body around, to use them as anchor points, or they might also be too stiff for you to create depression like on sand. So how do snakes solve this problem of moving over large obstacles that are too smooth to gain anchor points in terms of maintaining stability? And they can clearly do that, as you see from this video that we found on YouTube. Snake is very quickly traversing large steps one by one. So to begin to understand this problem, we studied the variable kingsnake traversing large step as a representative 3D obstacle, and we vary both the height and the surface friction of the step to look at how the snake responds to such variation in terrain changes. We study the same 3 individuals, collecting 10 trials for each treatment. So to quantify the 3D kinematics, we combine 3 techniques. First, we use multiple cameras to obtain different views and use direct linear transformation to reconstruct 3D kinematics. We also, to facilitate tracking, we also use these B tag markers that can be automatically tracked. And finally, we collaborate with colleagues in my department, Chirikjian's group, to apply a method that they developed initially for robotic motion planning. What this method does is essentially to interpolate between two markers to give you a continuous 3D body, a 3D representation of the midline of the body. And that includes not only the position, but also the orientation information. So for the next few slides, I'll just give a quick overview of this method. We just submitted this to JEB, and we also included the code and demo files. We're hoping this can be a useful tool to interpolate long limbless body, or even like limbed animals for if their body are long and slender like snakes. So this method works by interpolating between adjacent pairs of markers, so it's done piecewise over the body, and it has three major steps. First, we represent the body as a quasi-static elastic rod, which obviously is far from the biomechanical reality. The main purpose of that is to simplify the Lagrangian of the body so that we can use that as a cost function in the next step to simplify the mathematical solution. And the next step is what's called the backbone optimization, initially developed by Chirikjian. So the main goal of this is to solve the hyper-redundant problem. In this case, meaning that if you want to interpolate between two markers, as shown here, there can be infinite solutions. So you can then use a cost function. By minimizing that cost function, you can actually reach one or very few solutions very quickly. And finally, we apply the technique of inverse kinematics, which is to converge the ends of markers onto the measured markers. So how it works is like this. We have two markers and a midline of the real animal that we try to approach, we try to describe. So we start from an initial guess using initial spatial velocity, and we can integrate that towards the other end using an equation that's derived in step 2. And then we can look at how far that other end is from the other marker. And by gradually reducing the error between those two, which includes the error in both position and orientation, we can minimize the error to below a threshold, and we use that as our approximation of the midline. So here's a video showing our result. So this is interpolated piecewise and then smooth over the entire body. Here's the midline. Here's the orientation, local orientation along the midline. And if you know the radius of the animal, you can also infer the body surface. And we want to see how our method compares with purely geometric interpolation methods, such as the B-spline, widely used. So what we do here is, for our method, we pick two markers shown in red, and then we use another marker in between as the ground truth. So we interpolate between these two red markers and infer at the location of the marker in the middle what the position and orientation would be, and calculate the error compared to the ground truth. We can also do this for the B-spline, but for B-spline you need more than two markers, otherwise it will give you a straight line. So in this case, we use all the markers that we placed except for the ground truth marker, and here's the interpolated result. You can see that our method does better than the B-spline visually. We in fact apply this to all our kinematic data from this experiment, and you can see statistically we have lower error in both position and orientation. And I think this is partly because the model, even its oversimplification as an elastic rod, it is still that works better than pure geometric interpolation. Yeah, so with this method, we can then quantify how the animal moves and traverse such obstacles. Here's a high friction, low step. You can see the animal divides its body into three sections. The front and the rear parts are doing lateral undulation on the surface to propel it forward, while the body section in the middle cantilevers and maintains a roughly straight and fixed configuration during the traversal. And this divided pattern passes down the body as the animal moves up and forward. And in particular, if you focus on the front view projection, you can see that the cantilevering section is mostly in a vertical plane because its projection is a vertical line. And we found very similar patterns. When the step becomes higher, the animal obviously has to use a larger part of its body for cantilevering, but the overall pattern is conserved. And we found on low friction surfaces, the animal slips more, but nevertheless use this same strategy. And the most challenging high step, low friction case, the animal slips a whole lot and its movement becomes a little bit more like concertina because it kind of stops and starts moving intermittently, but still use this gait. So in summary, we found that the animal combines lateral undulation and cantilevering to traverse such large, smooth obstacles as a step. So at this point, we began to think about how this might be useful for robots. So when we look at how robots traverse such obstacles, here are a few examples. You can see that a lot of them use this what's called the follow the leader gait, in which each segment simply follows the previous one, and they would all deform their body entirely in a vertical plane. There's this other one from Howie Chosa's group, which uses a different artificial gait. But overall, when we look at all these previous robots, they plan their motion quite carefully and move slowly. And I think that's to be expected, because if you think about the stability challenge when you have a large part of your body cantilevering out of the horizontal plane, then if you only have a narrow base of support, then as soon as you have any little perturbation that push you sideways, you're going to be knocked over. So you have to really control your body carefully so that your center mass always falls within the narrow base of support, which explains why these are usually quite slow. Whereas the snake, as we observed, they form a much larger ground support using lateral undulation. And we think that this perhaps explains why they can traverse so stably. So perhaps they will be stable. So to test that, we used our 3D reconstruction to calculate the ground base of support shown in the red region, and then the center of mass and its projection. And we found that regardless of the friction and height changes, all the three animals in all trials maintain perfect quasi-static stability. Their center mass never goes out of these regions. So so we think that this might provide inspiration to make robots, to enable robots to traverse faster without having to control as carefully. And in turn, if we have a robot that can perform this kinds of locomotion, we can also use it as a tool to further understand the stability principles. So we did that. My student Qiyuan created this snake robot. Here he is moving the robot to demonstrate that we have these alternating yaw and pitch joint that can enable large 3D body deformation. In addition, as Bruce has already mentioned, snake has used this anisotropic friction from their scales to help them propel on flat, high friction surfaces. So when you slide a snake down a slope, if its head is facing downward, sliding forward, then you get a smaller friction compared to if it's sliding backward or laterally. So to enable that in our robot, Qiyuan added this one direction wheel, which is inspired from a ratchet mechanism, so that it interlocks when you try to roll backward, so it can only rotate forward, and we get a small rolling friction in the forward direction, but much larger sliding friction in the backward, as well as the lateral friction. So with this, we can then use a similar gait as we observed in the snake to enable the robot to traverse. As you can see from this video on the right, which is showing real time, the robot can traverse quite quickly, much like the animal does. And in fact, we collected multiple trials and found that it can achieve very high stability in this case, traversing a reasonably high step, which is about 20% its body length. So this all seems very good, but when we push the robot to traverse even higher step, we see that it starts to struggle much more and fail more. So in this case, about 38% body length, the robot only traverses half of the time. And it very often fails from various modes. Here's 100% particular mode that we observed, in which the robot rolled side to side, was unable to recover and eventually falls off and flips over. Yeah, so as I mentioned, there are many adverse events that can trigger eventual failure. So you saw the rolling. It can sometimes recover, sometimes fail. It can also sometimes yaw, meaning that the robot suddenly slips laterally and its heading is going to suddenly change relative to the step. And that can actually lead to forces, asymmetry in forces laterally, which can further lead to roll and fail. And sometimes it can become stuck here. So as we observe all our videos, this is a highly stochastic, these are highly stochastic events. It seems to be quite random, but when we collected multiple trials, we can then see the relative frequency at which these adverse events occurs and how it transitions between them to eventually lead to failure or sometimes recover to traverse. So as you have this, then you can see that some important statistical trends start to emerge. So here is the transition plot, for increasing step height. And if you focus on the red arrows at the bottom, you can see that for these, we found that the snake robot failed more and more at higher and higher probability as the step becomes higher, and that failure is always triggered by this roll instability, which eventually leads to flip over. And it becomes more and more severe as the step height increases. Yeah, so as we already mentioned, the snakes maintain perfect stability in these situations. So why are they doing so much better than the robot? And when you look at them, there are two obvious differences. The first one is the snake is much smoother. Its body is much more continuous because there's over 200 vertebrae, whereas our robots only has 20. But we cannot spend another 19 times $5,000 to build a robot to approach that. So what we decide to look instead is another aspect, which is their body compliance. So you can see the snake robot is obviously compliant, whereas our robot is almost entirely rigid. And this idea of body compliance helping conform to the environment is not new in the field of robotics. Whenever, from a lot of research, whenever the physical interaction with the environment is important, then body compliance can really help you simplify control and do better. One most important case is during climbing. A lot of work has been done, especially by Mark Tukalski's group. They can use these compliant fingers with springs as well as compliant spines to passively conform to large and small surface asperities to help better engage, interlock, and distribute the load to achieve high level high whole body climbing performance. In addition, in robotics grasping, you also need to have good physical contact with the object you're trying to grasp. So people have also added simple springs as well as more recently using compliant soft materials to do that. So inspired by all these previous studies and our observation, Qiyuan added this very simple car-like suspension system, basically springs, between the body and the wheels. And now without changing anything else, the robot is able to recover at much higher probability from such roll instability and traverse. And you can see the probability recovers to 90% in this case. And we did the similar analysis. This is what you saw earlier for the rigid robot. Just trying to remember the pattern at the bottom here. And here's for the compliant robot. You can see that clearly it's still quite stochastic, but statistically it suppresses all these roll instability and flipping over significantly. Yeah, so finally, so we think that our robot study provided more understanding in the stability principles, and at the same time, it also just happened to also improve the performance of robot relative to most previous robot. So here's a figure showing the step height of each robot. Each robot is able to traverse the maximum step height normalized by its body length, plotted as a function of the traversal time. And if you divide step height by traversal time, you would get a vertical traversal speed. So what this means is that if you draw a line connecting the origin to the data of any of these robots, then the slope of that line would be the normalized traversal speed. So we can clearly see that our robot achieves higher speed than most of these previous robots shown in gray, but is still falling behind the real snakes. And you probably already noticed there's one previous robot that has a higher normalized speed. It actually uses a very different strategy. It looks similar to the previous ones, but it actually pushes its body against the vertical surface, and there are active wheels that are propelling. So the wheels are driving it upward, so it can devote a much longer section because it doesn't have to use the base, the supporting body segment to lift a long section. But still, I think the major advantage of our robot would be that it has this much higher lateral stability, which in this case it still lacks. And finally, out of curiosity, we also tried our snake experiments in some other complex 3D terrain, and we see they seem to also use this strategy by using part of the body to do lateral undulation, and then the rest cantilevering to bridge large gaps. And we think that this might be a more generally useful strategy in diverse, complex environment. So for the sake of time, I'll skip this, and I'll just like to acknowledge my co-authors and a lot of lab members who have helped in this project, and many colleagues, especially Henry, who has given us so much help getting our snake locomotion program started, and our funding sources, and as well as the organizations who are sponsoring this symposium. And thank you all for your attention. I'll take questions.
We have plenty of time for questions.
Chen, it looks really terrific. I've seen a lot of your work, but I haven't been able to see this whole story. It's really terrific. Looks like, this is just intuitive, but it looks like the snakes sort of do a better job of pulling themselves up, whereas you're trying to push your robot up. And I'm wondering if that's kind of help sort of exacerbating this roll instability, because if you're kind of pulling, then you're going to be statically stable because the dominant force that you're generating is going to be from above the center of mass, right?
Yes.
So is that something you've looked into?
We haven't studied that systematically yet, but we do see evidence why our robot is not good at doing that. Let me show a slide. Oh, here. Here. Yeah. So I didn't get time to go into this, but the mechanism we think it works is that the compliance, much like the climbing and the grasping, it allows you to better conform. So to verify that, we quantified whether the wheels are in contact with the surface, both above and below the step, which is shown here. So that's a little schematic defining. So what's plotted here is what we call the conformation difference, or basically if a segment is in perfect contact, if both wheels are in good contact, then entirely symmetrically, like the distance of both wheel axle to the surface would be equal, and there will be no difference. So what this shows is that difference basically gives you an idea of the lateral or the roll asymmetry between the left and the right side. So what we found is that the part of the body below the step, that asymmetry is quite small, and it didn't change when the compliance is added. But on top of the step, it's much larger, and also the compliance helps reduce that significantly. So I think just somehow through it may be because initially the top part only has a smaller length as you try to progress forward and upward. Initially you have a very small length, so the majority of the propulsion and support is found on the bottom part. But for the robot, because it's still far from being well controlled as the real snake, so the top part starts to suffer some roll instability. It's not able to fully recover that, and it gets kind of amplified as you progress more forward. Yeah, so I think that the ability to in real time sense your contact with the environment and like adjust your body to better, in this case, like I guess redistribute that, as you were saying, to use more of the top section for pulling would be very useful. That's actually, we're thinking of adding kind of very simple pressure sensors into the entire robot to maybe try to solve that, and also study the principle there. Yes?
Have you tried that with super fat snake? I mean, the rolling stability.
With the what snake?
Super fat. Because I think.
Oh, super fat?
Yeah. I think one of the keys that is kind of overlooked here in the rolling stability is the aspect ratio.
Yes,
Here
yes.
your roll is fat
Sure.
compared to the snake.
Sure.
So is that
Yeah, I agree. And if you look at all those previous robots, they are able to do this entirely in the vertical plane because they do still have, it's small compared to the length, but it's not negligible. They have some footprint that is not negligible, so they can use good control to maintain their center of gravity within that. Yeah, so I think that's obviously another strategy. Yes. Do we have time? Okay.
Yeah, we got time.
I was just curious about your 3D interpolation method. Is there a minimum number of points that you guys require?
Oh, I see. Yeah, I didn't include it in my slides, but we did quantify, we did measure. So we instead of the number of points over the entire body, we did an experiment where we changed the separation between the two markers, which we interpolate between, and then we also put the animal in a very nice background. We're still doing the step traversal, but very nice high contrast background. So we use computer vision to extract the contour and then get a midline. Use that as a ground truth. It's certainly not the perfect, but to quantify this this interpolation error as we vary the marker spacing, what we found is that about below like 5 centimeter, 4 centimeter of spacing relative to the snake diameter is about 1 centimeter, so it's about maybe 3 to 4 body diameter length. Below that, the error is only a fraction of the body radius. But when that spacing goes up, then it quickly becomes larger. So yeah, it certainly depends on that. Yeah.
All right, great. Thanks very much, Chen.
Thank you.